Hi everyone, welcome to the first audio recorded lecture for English 484W. So in this lecture, I just wanted to build off some of the discussions that we were doing in our Discord. But to start, I'm going to be referencing Sigmund Freud a little bit in this lecture. So I thought maybe it would be good to just start off with my dream last night. So last night I had a dream, and this is kind of a recurring nightmare where I had to teach this class, but I hadn't finished You, and I hadn't even read the supplementary reading material by Eva Illouz. So I had to teach the class without having read the material. It was a nightmare. The class was also taking place on a cruise ship for some reason. And also when I got there, all the students were completely different than you guys. So this is a recurring nightmare that I have, and maybe I should go to psychoanalysis for it. So, but to get back to the course, so last week in the Discord, we kind of talked about the contradictions of Joe, and this discussion was primarily started by, I think, Wanshika, but also this came up in Megan's presentation as well, talking about the facades of Joe, but particularly Wanshika's question, number 2, she wrote, Joe is ironically contradicting throughout this novel. One line that gets me every time would be when Joe says, this must explain the diluted sense of privacy you have in regard to Beck's postings. What are some other examples throughout the novel where Joe is contradicting / ironic? What do you think about his character? Why is he so contradicting? I think these contradictions, if you are getting to the end of the novel, they definitely accelerate a little bit, especially in terms of privacy. Joe enters into a completely contradictory stage when he finds out that Beck has violated his own privacy by doing the kind of the less elaborate violation of just going into the weird hole in his wall and seeing what's going on in there and finding that he is creepier than she could have ever imagined. So that topic of contradiction does kind of become even more serious as the novel goes along. I just wanted to read out some of the responses from the Discord, just because I think the Discord discussions have been really good, so I just want to give them some additional airtime, so to speak. So Michael responded, to me, the most contradicting aspect of Joe is that sometimes he's just as agreeable as he is antagonizing. Okay, so Joe is a misogynist, psychopath, stalker, and I hate him for that. But I also hate pretentious people like Peach and Benji. When Joe shit-talks Peach and traps Benji up in his basement, it almost feels like vigilante justice. I can see some readers treating Joe the same way they treat Trump. Yeah, he's rough around the edges, but he's doing what everyone else is afraid to do. So all in all, Joe is fucked in the head, but he's still forcing people who err to change their ways. Now, disclaimer, and this is all in caps, I definitely do not condone anything Joe does, but I see the danger in people who might think Joe is right. And maybe with him being the hot guy on the TV show, this only exacerbates the influence he has. Just to go into another response, so Juliana wrote, Joe is so irritating in my opinion because of how contradicting he is, and how he fails to see his own flaws, even when those flaws are the same that he's critiquing in other people. Another example, different from the one you mentioned, is, quoting from the text, the assholes are always puzzled when the universe is restored, when they are held accountable for their cowardly, pretentious, loveless ways. In this instance, he is referring to Benji being locked in the cage as the way of the universe being restored, for the way that he treats Beck. That segment also made me think that Joe is so disconnected from reality that he believes his actions to be the universe's work, like he himself is doing the right thing. Furthermore, he speaks of being held accountable for being a coward and acting in loveless ways. Joe himself is doing things he believes to be out of love for Beck, and those actions are horrific, cowardly, and loveless too, but he fails to recognize himself in his statement. I think, again, I don't know if Juliana had gotten to the end of the book at this point, but the question of, Joe talks about love a lot, and we kind of talked about love a little bit in last week's Zoom meeting, but by the end of the novel, the question of Joe's loving attitude toward Beck becomes even more kind of problematic. The emotion that he describes as love is, as Juliannes says here, loveless. It's kind of a loveless love, which is kind of this exemplifies, I think, the paradoxical nature of Joe's personality. So I'm just going to read a couple more comments. I think this discussion was good. So just one more comment from Jessica, who did the video presentation this week. I also found Joe to be contradicting throughout the first third of the novel. I really noticed this in the scene near the train tracks. He convinces himself that he's protecting Beck from the horrors that she could endure as a result of being alone and drunk in a bad area. However, he contradicts himself when he saves her and fantasizes about raping her on the tracks. Also, after he says she has a deluded sense of privacy, which almost justifies him stalking her through her window, he thinks, you parade too much and it's unsafe, and it only takes one weirdo to spot you inside and decide to go and get you. I don't know if he realizes the irony in thinking this, because to me, he is that weirdo. But maybe the fact that he has allowed himself to have control over his impulses makes him feel less creepy and more moral than that of the balcony rapist type that he describes. I think contradictory statements like these act as reaffirmations in his mind to justify his actions and protect his ego by convincing himself that he is not wrong in what he is doing, even though his behavior is very odd and scary. And I think this personality, to kind of talk about trends that have kind of echoed through the course and these terrible men that we've been reading, and maybe just to comment on that, I mean, I have been kind of, with this reading list, perhaps overexposing us to kind of awful male characters. But I mean, I do think there's value to that, and at least the sense of realism that I'm not one of those people who think that all men are evil and all women are good, as it kind of came up in the Marie Calloway story. But there is kind of serious problems, I think, just by us being in, like what I described in the first lecture, the Me Too era. There are serious problems right now in terms of gender relationships between men and women. And like Eva Luz says in the article that I made you guys read this week, though there are a lot of happy relationships between men and women, or between same-sex couples as well, there are also kind of a lot of problems, and kind of new problems, that hopefully by exposing us to all these kind of, yes, very problematic male characters, we do kind of see where those problems come from. And also Beck definitely is the victim of the story, definitely is the woman who suffers the consequences of these problems with contemporary gender relations to the largest extent possible. It gets truly horrific near the end of the novel. But she is also, I think, an interesting character in not being a complete saint. She has personality traits, as she does say in her kind of forced confession at the end of the novel, that aren't pure or innocent. She also has some behaviors that are definitely not as problematic as Joe's, definitely not as pure evil, but there are kind of issues in terms of the way that she relates to men as well. So yeah, so what I was going to say was kind of a trend through the whole course. So from what Jessica was talking about in terms of Joe's kind of contradictory mindset, it's kind of the exceptional status of the one dude that says, I'm not like other kind of creepy men, I'm special. And this kind of goes back to the feminist, where again he has that kind of mindset that he knows that there's men who read feminist theory just to get laid, but at the same time, even though he knows that there exist men like that, and he kind of distances himself or separates himself from those men, he is still definitely that man. And like Jessica says, Joe is definitely that creeper, that weirdo. So that kind of mindset, I think, is repeating through the course of kind of men thinking that they are the exception to these kind of bad behaviors. Okay, so like I said, I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit about Freud. I think Paige mentioned Freud in last week's Discord as well, and probably not in a positive light. I am kind of a Freud apologist, so we can get into that, or we don't have to get into that. But yeah, I'm just going to talk about Freud because Paige mentioned Freud a little bit. in the Discord. So I think there's a concept from Freud that is kind of very valuable for thinking about you. And definitely I think Joe is a character that could benefit from actual therapy or a psychoanalyst to kind of, I don't know, to help fix his very broken psyche. Even though he does go to therapy, it's completely artificial because he's lying from the very start. And Dr. Nikki doesn't seem to be the best therapist either. So Freud had the concept of ambivalence. And that is the way that for a person, there can be another person or an object that inspires feelings of both love and hatred at the same time in that person. So there can be a contradictory object for the other person. And definitely I think that Beck is that object for Joe. She inspires both feelings of love and hatred, sometimes at the very same time, or sometimes from sentence to sentence. He's expressing love for her, then he's expressing this kind of deep-seated hatred of her at the same time. So the concept of ambivalence does come up in the Eva Illou's book, not in the chapter that we read, but in a later chapter. And she kind of takes Freud's concept of ambivalence and alters it a little bit for the kind of the contemporary system of relationships. So she writes, however, I would argue that contemporary romantic ambivalence is different. Again, it refers to dampened feelings. Cool ambivalence might better describe the state, since it implies one of the main emotional tonalities referred to earlier, namely abulia. Modern ambivalence takes a number of forms, not knowing what one feels for someone else. Is it true love? Do I really want to spend my life with him? Feeling conflicting emotions, the desire to explore new relationships while continuing in the current relationship, saying something but not feeling the emotions that should accompany the words, I love being with you, but I cannot bring myself to commit completely. Ambivalence is not intrinsic to the psyche, but is a property of the institutions that organize our lives. And she goes on a little bit, but I think this kind of cool ambivalence does help kind of describe the character of Beck. And the quote that I have here is, again, near the end of the novel on page 393 of my version. And Joe is kind of reporting her speech. Beck says that she's pictured the same wedding. The song is My Sweet Lord, with a million different guys, including you, Joe. So Beck is kind of this character that does embody this kind of cool ambivalence, where she has kind of multiple options available to her, and she's kind of ambivalent about which one she wants to choose. But as Illouz makes clear in the kind of the introduction that I did make you guys read, there's a reason why Beck might not be so keen to jump into a relationship with Joe or any of these guys. There's a lot of ways in which contemporary relationships are structured in a way that women kind of get the short end of the stick. So another quote from Illouz, in her controversial The Dialectic of Sex, quoted at the beginning of the chapter, Shula Smith Firestone went a step further. The source of men's social power and energy is the love women provide for them and continue to provide for them, thus suggesting that love is the cement with which the edifice of male domination has been built. Romantic love not only hides class and sex segregation, but in fact makes it possible. In Ty Grace Atkinson's striking words, romantic love is the psychological pivot in the persecution of women. Ultimately, male power resides in the fact that gender identities and hierarchy are played out and reproduced in the expression experience of romantic sentiments, and that conversely, sentiments sustain broader economic and political power differentials. Illouz kind of goes against this a little bit in terms of the kind of the murky way that this defines male power. For instance, male power is not so much economic as it used to be when these writers were writing, even though there is still the gender wage gap, like we see in You. The higher class character is Beck, and Joe is kind of a lower class character. So he doesn't exactly have economic power over Beck, but he does have a certain kind of power. And Illouz does kind of this is kind of the purpose of her book, to investigate this kind of new form of power that men kind of still hold over women, even when those economic relations of domination don't exist as strongly as they once did. Okay, so that is kind of, I think, Beck's ambivalence toward all these kind of different relationships. She says, yeah, a million different guys. And I think this, if I'm remembering right, this book was published in around 2013. So not exactly in the Tinder age or right around when the Tinder age was starting to come about. I think Beck's kind of surfing. I think surfing is a good word for the Craigslist casual encounters section of the web. Which that part of the website has since been discontinued for some reason. I'm not exactly sure. But that Beck's surfing of Craigslist casual encounters definitely seems a little bit like kind of early stage Tinder activity to me. That kind of surfing through multiple kind of guys, and although I think that website had more kind of a writing component than Tinder. Okay, but that's Beck's kind of ambivalence or cool ambivalence. What I think Joe has is real ambivalence. So he is really, there's no kind of coolness to his emotions. He is really kind of stuck between love and hatred of Beck. And as Freud kind of talked about, this can lead to obsessive thought. You obsess over this object that causes you both love and hatred. And it also inspires feelings of doubt and compulsion, as Freud talked about it. And this kind of comes out when Joe visits Dr. Nicky as his therapist, and he kind of lies and he says that his problem is OCD or obsession with a YouTube video, when really there is a little bit of a truth contained in that lie, that his problem really is obsession, that he's obsessed with Beck. So that kind of ambivalence of Joe toward Beck, I just have a couple quotes here. Obviously, he expresses his love for Beck at multiple points in the novel, but he also expresses kind of this hatred of not just Beck, but also women. So on page 215, there's these kind of just misogynistic quotes. You tuck your dirty tissues into your mangy purse. Ah, woman. And then on page 381, he's cleaning at her apartment. It reeks of bananas and womanhood. So he's definitely misogynist, and even though he loves Beck, there's parts of her that he seems to have complete disdain for. And sometimes his kind of love for her and his hatred of her, they rapidly kind of alternate sentence to sentence. So for Freud, obsession, in terms of ambivalence, is thought of as the way in which the subject deals with a problematic object, one that unsettles them or gives them a certain anxiety. And just to look at that, look at Joe's initial reaction to Beck in the first encounter. So he starts shaking and he wants to take a prescription pill for anxiety. So Beck's appearance kind of really unsettles him, and he's kind of wants to know why he's feeling this way. And again, from the Freudian perspective, the subject in dealing with this problematic object seeks to bring it under their control, to incorporate the object into their own identity and rob it of its otherness, of its mystery. And this again begins from the first encounter. And Joe writes, I press my thumb into the wet ink on your receipt, and the ink of Guinevere Beck stains my skin. So that's the kind of the last sentence of the first chapter. And Beck is kind of entering into him. And then he kind of desires this as well, that she will kind of become a part of him. And later he sort of achieves this goal. So listening to Beck complain about Blythe, he achieves what he desires in incorporating Beck into himself, or himself into Beck. He writes, I feel like I'm living inside of you, through you. I know what it's like to be you, and you're right. The fantasy of this feeling is later exposed when he finally says, God, I know you, on page 402. The earlier quote was from 165. And kind of this failure of actually knowing her is kind of immediately exposed at the end of the novel. So in being this kind of obsessive obsessing over Beck, there's all the typical kind of Freudian behaviors. He never lets the object leave his sight. It always has to be under investigation, whether digital or in person. He begins to collect objects of her for his so-called box of Beck, so that he can always have part of her around him. So this box of Beck, there's a metaphorical slippage, I think, from that box of Beck to the cage at the bottom of the bookstore that, spoiler alert, he eventually places her in, where he finally really has kind of this total control of her, total possession of her. And then finally the book of Beck, where he kind of has all her short stories, and he binds it, he converts her into a book, into an object that he can kind of carry around, and that isn't as kind of unsettling or anxiety provoking as before. Okay, so why does Beck cause all these kind of problems for Joe? Or why is he so obsessive over her? At numerous points in the novel, he says, "I can't figure you out," or compares her to an onion that he can kind of endlessly unravel, discovering more and more new layers under layers under layers under layers. It's also the reason why he breaks up with Karen Minty. He writes, "She is so much easier to read than you are," on page 302. And I think that's because his desire is synonymous with his anxiety about her desire. What does she want? And that's kind of the mystery that drives him. And we're getting even more and more Freudian, and I'm going to blame this on Paige for bringing up Freud and then setting me on this path. But one of the final questions of Freud, even when he was on his deathbed, was "Was will das Weib?" or "What do women want?" So Freud once said to Maria Bonaparte, "The great question that has never been answered and which I have not yet been able to answer, despite my 30 years of research into the feminine soul, is what does a woman want?" And of course, if you've gotten to the end, this is one of the final questions that Joe demands of Beck. What do you want? And this question is somewhat left unanswered by Beck. It's kind of an impossible question, I think, to ask of someone. It doesn't really say anything about Beck. It really more says something about Joe or about Freud, that they're driven into obsession by this kind of mystery of feminine desire. And Joe is the only kind of person that is able to give an answer, kind of a provisional answer, because it's not Beck's own words. And he says, "You want you." So this kind of circular loop of an answer, "you want you," I think it's definitely exacerbated by the internet, which allows us to be in relation to ourselves to such a massive degree. It allows us to want ourselves or desire ourselves, because we of course use social media platforms just as much to express ourselves to others as express ourselves to ourselves. So, I mean, we've been talking a lot about kind of cyber stalking in the last week or so. And I mean, who is the person that you guys cyber stalk the most? And maybe you're like Joe, hopefully, I really hope not. But maybe you're more like me, where I think the person that I cyber stalk the most is myself. And that includes looking at my own Facebook profile a lot. That includes looking at my own Twitter a lot, my own Instagram. There's the contemporary poet Kenneth Goldsmith, who wrote a book called "Wasting Time on the Internet," and one of the things that he does was look through his kind of internet history to kind of study himself, what he was searching. And one of the things that he was surprised by was how often he searched for himself. So, and this is something that I think, not to be too TMI, but I search myself on the internet quite a bit as well. I think I'm probably my biggest cyber stalker, which is, again, kind of what Joe's talking about. You want you. Yeah, maybe I want me when I'm searching myself on the internet or looking at my own Facebook profile. And maybe this is just kind of something where this is kind of an individual affliction of myself, but I am curious whether, when we're having these discussions about cyber stalking, whether we are our biggest kind of cyber stalkers, or you guys have maybe kind of a different kind of internet behavior than me, myself and Kenneth Goldsmith. So yes, Beck is kind of a very frequent user of social media. Obviously, she has different platforms, and like I was kind of talking about in the Zoom session, these social media platforms kind of add more layers to the onion that Joe kind of likens back to. So there's more kind of layers to peel through, and this is kind of exhibited by Joe kind of going through multiple platforms of Beck, from her email to her Facebook to her Twitter. He's reading all these different kind of parts of her and interpreting her, and all these kind of different layers kind of increase that desire of his, I think, for searching for the real Beck at the onion's center, that kind of kernel or pit, even though onions don't really have a center, I don't think. I think it's just all kind of layers. So all these kind of multiple layers to Beck's personality kind of increase, I think, Joe's desire for getting to the real Beck. And as it kind of becomes clear near the end of the novel, there is no real getting to the real Beck. She is just these kind of layers upon layers of performance. I mean, at least we're never going to get to the real Beck through the perspective of Joe. Okay, so this is kind of talking about the end of the novel, so hopefully you're kind of getting near that point and I'm not spoiling too much. I would kind of prepare yourselves. It is very kind of difficult reading. I was surprised, reading it again, how truly brutal the ending is. I am kind of interested in how kind of surprised you guys were by the ending, if you kind of knew it was kind of progressing towards something like this, or if you kind of held out hope. I think, as Fletcher kind of mentioned to me I think it was a private message, that Joe would have some kind of epiphany and realize the kind of the contradictory nature of his perspective on Beck. So that ambivalence of Beck being kind of between love and hatred, reaches its apotheosis at the novel's ending, where the question becomes, again, this is a major kind of spoiler, but how can you murder the person you love? And Joe finally does kind of get an epiphany when he does kind of commit this action, even though it's way too late at this point. It is kind of the only, I think, scene of self-reflection in the novel, when he's finally done the action that all his behaviors have kind of been leading toward. And he says, how could I have done this? What the fuck is wrong with me? On page 413. So if he had this, I think this is kind of an epiphany, even though it's kind of brought on by just him taking his behaviors to their most extreme. But I think this is like the one part in the novel where he does have some kind of elements of self-reflection. And though this scene kind of it is a little bit surprising, especially in the way that the novel is structured. So the way that Kepnes structures it is that Joe and Beck have their kind of closest, most intimate moments right before this truly horrific ending. So Kepnes definitely structures it in a way that that kind of puts this like intimacy between them right next to this horrible scene of violence. And I think that even though this ending is surprising, there's a lot of kind of feminist theory that kind of predicts this kind of ending. So in one of the early lectures on talking about the Marie Calloway text, I quoted from Andrea Dworkin, and she's kind of this extreme, some say feminist theorist. I think she's great, but she has kind of some of the more extreme views on gender relations. And she wrote, she connected male sexuality with murder by arguing that sex and murder are fused in the male consciousness, so that one without the other is unthinkable and impossible, and that the annihilation of women is a source of meaning and identity for men. So again, this sounds very kind of extreme, but at the same time, it completely describes what transpires in this novel. So there's definitely kind of a kernel, I think, of truth to what Dworkin is talking about. More quotes from Dworkin. She describes heterosexuality as the stuff of murder, not love. Men love death. In everything they make, they hollow out a central place for death. Let its rancid smell contaminate every dimension of whatever still survives. Men especially love murder. In art they celebrate it, and in life they commit it. They embrace murder as if life without it would be devoid of passion, meaning, and action, as if murder were solace, stilling their sobs as they mourn the emptiness and alienation of their lives. In male culture, slow murder is the heart of the eros, fast murder is the heart of action, and systematized murder is the heart of history. And we are dealing with a fictional text here, but I mean, I think this is certainly true. I mean, we're living under the conditions of COVID right now. There's been numerous stories of domestic violence, sometimes extreme. There was an event on Salt Spring recently that, I mean, Dworkin is really getting at something here that I don't think we can really avoid, that kind of violence and relationships between men and women are still kind of very interlinked. And I mean, there was also the Nova Scotia event that, again, yeah, I mean, even though we're kind of dealing with a fictional text, and I think a fictional text, we can kind of examine it hopefully from a distance because it is kind of imaginary. Beck isn't a real person, and hopefully we can have some kind of critical distance toward it. At the same time, these are kind of very real things that are happening in our society today, and sometimes it's very hard to kind of hold any kind of critical distance toward them because they are kind of very close to a lot of us. So yeah, Dworkin, obviously in those kind of quotes that I read, very kind of pessimistic about men. I don't know if I totally think that her kind of perspective is completely, I don't know how to put it, but completely helpful or accurate. I'm less pessimistic than her, but when her description, I think, echoes so strongly what happens in this novel and what is still happening in our contemporary society, there's definitely a kind of a strong truth content to it then. Yeah, so again, kind of going off this kind of pessimism, just one more quote here. And sorry if this is a little bit depressing, but Catherine McKinnon, again, one of these kind of more, some people frame her as one of these kind of more extreme feminists. She claimed that the universal system of patriarchy is maintained through heterosexuality and sexual violence. For McKinnon, sexuality is crucial to women's subordination, and she theorizes it as a dynamic of inequality. Gender derives from sexual dominance, not vice versa. The formula reads as follows: sexuality equals heterosexuality equals the sexuality of male dominance and female submission. McKinnon added that sexuality is a dynamic of control by which male dominance in forms that range from intimate to institutional, from a look to rape, eroticizes and thus defines man and woman, gender identity, and sexual pleasure, and it maintains and defines male supremacy as a political system. So I'm not just reading these quotes to depress everyone, but I think these quotes definitely kind of help explain for me at least how sex-obsessed Joe is, which is one of his kind of main personality traits. He just completely loses his mind over Beck's body. I don't even need to provide quotes because almost every page of this book has Joe kind of just losing his mind in kind of this mad horniness. And frequently these sex-obsessed musings take the form of describing Beck like an animal. So on page 214, he says, "You relax your arms and lower your legs, and when animals open up like that, they want to fuck. You're my animal on my sofa." So obviously kind of dehumanizing to describe a human being as an animal. I don't even really need to say anymore. And again, it kind of reaches its climax at the end when Joe becomes Beck's zookeeper. So that kind of, yeah, that's Joe kind of uses sexuality not as kind of just like this healthy attraction between bodies, but he uses it as a tool of kind of his dominance over Beck and her kind of necessary submission to him. Yeah, and then whenever Beck kind of deprives Joe of sex, he says stuff like on page 173, "You strip all the man out of me piece by piece, and I'm your phone bitch." So when Beck doesn't give Joe sex, he becomes feminized. So basically we have Joe having this kind of crazy obsession, or perhaps neediness for Beck? And again, I've been kind of probing this question. Where does this kind of neediness come from? Why is he so obsessed over Beck? And going back to the Dworkin quote about kind of the emptiness of male identity, at one point Beck asked Joe a question about him, and he says, "You want to know about me, and I tell you, I like you a lot." So Joe doesn't even really have any kind of identity beyond his obsession or his liking or loving of Beck. It's Beck that gives his life meaning. And that's an incredible burden to place on a person when that person is the only thing that really gives your life meaning. I mean, Joe likes books, for sure. They give some meaning to his life, even though he seems to use these books just as a pursuit tool for Beck. There's also kind of a really sad part I find near the end where he's talking about taking kind of university courses, but he's not talking about taking university courses for any kind of personal or self-interest or development. He's talking about taking courses to please Beck. So yeah, again, kind of just placing the meaning of his life as being dependent on her kind of validation of him. So this kind of connects with one more kind of gender relation theorist, really influential, R.W. Connell, who wrote a book on hegemonic masculinity. And he wrote that hegemonic masculinity has no meaning outside its relationship to emphasize femininity. So yeah, masculinity, our sense of identity of what it means to be men, relies on this kind of emphasized femininity, which of course Beck kind of in that very first chapter appearing in like the pink jeans, she is definitely kind of emphasized femininity, and all these kind of men kind of circulate around her because of the kind of the meaning that she will provide to their lives. Okay, so yeah, I think that's all I kind of wanted to say. I've kind of done a kind of deep dive into Joe's psyche, and hopefully there was some stuff there that I was talking about that is useful as well to you guys in kind of understanding this, I think, very difficult piece of literature. That's all I have for this week, so I'm just going to be uploading this audio lecture. Just some other kind of notes. So I did attend the What Does the App Want that was held by the Freud Museum. So I'm going to be posting the link to that in the Discord, but I'm also going to be giving kind of a report on it. Hopefully I'll just be posting kind of a summary of what they talked about also in the Discord. So yeah, that's all I think I want to say. I hope you're all doing well, and I hope this novel is not kind of really kind of being a miserable read for you, but that there is something perhaps a little bit useful in it for thinking about kind of the topics of this course. But that's it. I'll see you guys in the Discord. Bye for now.